This afternoon in here, we have our education keynotes, and we're going to begin with two leaders from Academy21. The session is going to ask, how can schools turn the promise of SEND reform into day-to-day capacity? How do you get better attendance and successful reintegration? Our two speakers are Alessandro Popozzi, who began his career as an English teacher through Teach First and has led as a head teacher and a deputy across inclusion, pastoral care and curricula. He was executive head teacher of Academy21 and now oversees all of its operations. Joining him is Amy Husband. She is executive head at Academy21 with trust-wide responsibility for safeguarding, inclusion and school improvement. She's also an evidence lead in education, the DFE and the EEF. Please, can you give them a warm round of applause to welcome them both to the stage?
So that was a lovely introduction. Thank you very much. And I'm Amy. I'm executive head teacher of Academy21, which is the UK's largest online alternative provision. We serve thousands of students every year from across the country. And my background in terms of headship, I've been a head for 11 years now, primary trained, but moved into the dark art of secondary a few years back now and fell in love. And this is my first headship in an alternative provision. And we serve students working in partnership with you as schools, local authorities and multi-academy trusts from year 5 right through to year 11. So, the journey of a child, one childhood, one chance. And I know the magnitude of that is imposed on the people in this room. The role that we get to play, the privilege that we hold in shaping what that chapter looks like for our young people, whether they're tiny to us or whether they're post-60, about to embark on adulthood, the privilege is enormous. The SEND reforms are something that will be on the mind of the majority of people in the room. And as we wait for the final version of the white paper to be published, I'm sure many of you have the same questions that we have as school leaders. How can I make the most of these reforms? What does it look like in my setting? And how do I translate this into meaningful, sustained impact for my most vulnerable learners? We hope today's session will be able to give you a few of our top tips. We work with around 1,200 partner schools across the UK. And so although Sandra and I will both be speaking from a place of experience in terms of school leadership and headship, we're actually aiming to share with you some of the best practice that we see up and down the country where learners with SEND and additional needs are catered for exceptionally well. So I have a question for you, and I'm really, really hoping this is where my primary teacher comes in, because I'm going to look for a brave volunteer. When your learners leave your doors for the last time, whether you are at an infant setting, a primary setting, a secondary setting, a specialist setting, what do you hope to have given them? What is it that you hope to have given them? And I am going to ask for brave volunteers to just shout some answers to me. Confidence, thank you.
Independence.
Independence, absolutely. And that looks so different at every age and stage. Independence in an infant setting might look like, being able to pop their coat on themselves or use a knife and fork properly. Independence at the end of a secondary chapter could look like that confidence to write a CV and sit in front of a college lecturer for an interview about A-levels. Absolutely. Anything else? Resilience. More important than ever before. We are in a world that is changing so rapidly. Resilience, confidence, self-esteem, independence, all of those things are crucial for our children to be able to navigate that with confidence and feeling like they belong in that world. So, SEND reforms. This is where we talk about the new system, that as a sector, we are working together regardless of the stripe of government. We are working together to reform a system that has been widely acknowledged as in crisis. The impact of the decisions we make today, as a sector and as individual settings or as multi-academy trusts, local authorities, they will shape children's experience of primary, secondary and higher education for decades to come, which is why it's so important that we get it right now. I've deliberately chosen this graphic. So for me, again, speaking from a place of headship, I'm thinking about my first primary headship, my first secondary headship, having your own inclusion framework. You may refer to that differently, but having your own plan for inclusion, for me, it's represented really well here in that molecular structure. It's about ensuring you have enough branches, you have enough options, interventions, provisions, specialists, experts at hand, as we now know that will be the new terminology. You have enough of those to support not only the needs that are in your building now, but the emerging needs that will evolve over time. Your structure needs to be nimble. You need to be able to add different things into that menu of choice, so that when you are presented in the inevitability that we all are with a need that you haven't come across before, you have a menu of tried and tested, research-led interventions and provisions that you can offer at all the various layers, which we'll talk about shortly, of support. We hear this phrase a lot, inclusive by design or inclusion by design. What we mean by that is the universal offer. So those of us who've been around the block a few times, in old money, we would refer to this as wave 1, wave 2, wave 3 provision. Our universal offer is that everybody receives. Being inclusive by design is about making difference the default. So when we start with that mindset, we shape our curriculum, our physical environment, our recruitment, and all of the intervention package surrounding children with additional needs. Difference is the default. Inclusion is the start point. Where we have seen real impact is where schools have not only a broad and balanced curriculum, but actually a broad and brave curriculum, taking those safe risks to allow learners in your individual contexts to have that opportunity of knowledge and experiential skills that will equip them for the world that they are entering into. Codifying an ethos that's anchored in belonging. What do we mean by that? So where we work with our partner schools and partner settings, and we see a truly inclusive ethos, what we see is that it permeates every layer of school practice. We see it in policy, we see it in interactions in the corridor. We see it not only in the way staff talk to children, but the way staff talk about children. We see it in parental feedback. It's tangible. And so when we are codifying our own ethos and living out our visions and values, it's so important that they're not just words on a paper or beautiful painted words on a mural. And then finally, having robust and tiered plans for the targeted layers of support that sit underneath the universal offer. So hopefully you're familiar with this diagram here. This is in the white paper. And this refers to, again, old money, waves 1, 2, and 3, you'll remember. Targeted provision is that's given in school by staff that are employed by the setting. But it's for children who need something additional to or different from. Targeted Plus is where those external partners, those specialists and experts at hand, are able to offer their advice and input where the need is specific and you need something that little bit deeper. And finally, specialist. So children and young people receiving specialist support, typically through an EHCP, and that may well be in a specialist setting or a specialist base. You might be sat there thinking, why is Amy talking us through a diagram that we already know? It's because it segues beautifully into talking to you about what we do. So Academy21 can fit every single layer of this support. So, last slide from me. Inclusion is a mindset. I first trained as a Senko in 2012 when the new Nasenko Award and was the recommendation by the government. And actually, I had a real cynical attitude about going on that course. I just thought it was a tick box exercise. I don't need this. I know what I'm doing as a Senko. It was the best thing I ever could have done. Inclusion is a mindset. It's about the attitude that we hold as leaders and how that translates in our behaviour, in our spoken language, and in our ethos in schools. And that's hugely powerful, because if we set the tone, we set that bar high, and we insist on that ethos in every interaction, in every communication with our families, in every dialogue exchange between staff, all of a sudden, inclusion becomes something that is just embedded and not a bolt-on. So, before I hand over to Sandro, I'm not going to ask you to answer these ones out loud, don't worry. These are some questions I'd like you to consider. Would all of your children say that they felt like they belong? I would imagine so. But it's a good point to reflect on. Are your team of staff confident in supporting various SEND needs? And do they devote time to becoming so? So if you're implementing professional development on the use of accessibility tools for students with a diagnosis of dyslexia, that's quite specific. How are we checking in on that? How are we looking at that and the impact of that professional development? And where your staff perhaps have an interest in something because they have a student in their class with that need, or it's a personal interest, how much room is there in your professional development annual calendar for a bit of self-directed study? Is innovative SEND provision prioritised in your school? Or is it the traditional SEND provision, the interventions that we've seen go round and round and round time and time again, which have their place and work for most? What about when they don't? So it's a reflection question for you. Is your approach to SEND and provision innovative enough to meet the needs of today's children? And last of all, would your staff, parents, pupils, governors, any of your stakeholders, would they give me the same answer as you? Over to Sandra.
Thanks, Amy. Hello, everybody. Oh, this is loud. Great to see you all here. Thank you for joining. The second part of this presentation, I want to just build a little bit on what Amy said about innovation there. I'm really conscious when I talk about this. Your settings that you're in, there's only so much you can impact in that community you're in that school, on those children. But a lot of innovation needs to be driven by the permissions, by the investment that might happen around us. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about what happens globally, because I think it's exciting. I think it's interesting. But when I'm doing that, I think it's really worthwhile thinking none of this really happens, this global innovation or innovation at a national scale, without it being driven by people like yourselves. People who are working in schools, showing that things work, showing that innovative approaches work. So within the maelstrom and the complexity of reforms that are going to be lasting a decade, there is room for innovation. There is room for you to try things. Amy and I speak to Ofsted inspectors almost every week for the schools that use our provision. We talk to them about it, and quite regularly, they're very interested in the choice to meet need, the right choice of an AP at the right time. So often there's quite a receptive environment out there to those who are trying to be at the vanguard of doing things a bit differently. The two kind of anchor points for what I'm going to talk about are about accessibility and capacity. And that's really important because for children, no matter what you do, if it's not accessible, if the intervention isn't accessible, if your universal provision isn't accessible, it doesn't go to work. And equally, the capacity, whether it's in your setting or more broadly, if it's not there, it'll run out of steam. And these are the points in which technology and innovation can really, really help. Just a little bit about where we're coming from with this. Amy mentioned it earlier. the amount of schools that we work with is a real privilege. We work across the country in almost every single local authority, with those local authorities as well as schools within that. And that gives us a really, it's not a unique insight, but it's a quite a profound insight to what's happening in different areas, whether it's a coastal setting, whether it's an urban setting, whether it's something rural, whatever it might be. Lots of things are being tried. They're very contextual, they're very community-based. But what this allows us to understand is where people are brave, where people are trying different things, like our provision, for example, it can have a really, really profound impact. That's a global thing that I spoke about. I don't obsessively read about education internationally. There's lots of great publications and information like now, but a few stories do really pique my interest. The first up here, recent one in Estonia. Estonia has brought in, or is bringing in, an AI product into their schools. But what they've done is they've trained their teachers on this pre-announcement. They've spent months and months training and teaching how to use the AI model that they're bringing into their schools before they've launched it. They're being innovative. They're pushing the boundary. They're taking teachers with them. And the model that they're using doesn't spit answers out to young learners. It's questioning. It's a Socratic questioning model. And the idea behind this is leveraging technology on a national scale to improve outcomes for young learners. Many of you will know Estonia is the highest performing country in the PISA rankings in Europe. And then when we think about another country, Singapore, the top of the PISA rankings, Singapore, in children, have a day every 2 weeks or 3 weeks or a month where they're at home, home-based learning. Now, that country does that in part. It's about resilience. When they have natural disasters, if there's another pandemic, they've realised from the experience in COVID that actually it's really important to build that resilience in their young learners. And it's also really important, and they see the benefits of it for certain subsets of learners, that they learn really well. And I look at these examples and I think there's a real space for the UK to be a national leader. And it is in some ways, but it very much is in others. We have committees in our government. We have projects coming out to the Parliament that are all about harnessing innovation. But there is a reticence, I would say, around innovating. But that reticence isn't really existing in schools. And that previous slide I showed you shows that, because all of those schools are users of an online provision, SAR provision, and that is quite an innovative thing to do. So back to my original point, you have that scope, you have that room to innovate, to try and do the thing that's the best fit for that young learner. And in time, I think our country will be more like Estonia, more like Singapore, in trying things at a national level that are really, really impactful. And there's a journey here. These clips are just from news articles, mostly from the same news outlet, but where you can see from 2020 through to 2026, the different kind of rhythm or the different shifting narrative around technology. Remote learning, at that point in time, very obvious reasons for it. Embracing technology's power later on, understanding actually there were some benefits to what happened when learners were online in the pandemic. Margaret Mulholland, absolutely fantastic writer with TES and a member of a rival union, writes really eloquently about the role of online within the AP setting and how flexible it is. And then finally, looking at potential in training of assistive technology for teachers to support young learners. These things are really important, and I think they're part of a journey towards realising that the shape and look of education might be quite different in many years to come. So back onto the reforms that Amy mentioned earlier. I've just picked out a few elements. There are so many parts to the reforms that we have to get our heads around. And we spent a long time as a leadership group in our school trying to work out which bits are relevant to us, which bits are relevant to our schools. But generally, you have greater mainstream ownership around inclusion, greater accountability, pooled funding, new inclusion standards, EHP rules. These are big, meta, high-level things that are going to shift the priorities of leaders. You have LA strategies, school inclusion strategies during December. These are things where you have that opportunity to think, here's my money, here's the quality of my staff, what am I actually going to do differently to try and meet need? And it's a real point in time, this, where you can be innovative, where you can think, what am I going to put in place that is actually going to make a difference in the future to our young learners where things might not have in the past? We know about individual support plans and the potential burdens around them, and then there's the money that comes alongside it. The IMF money, the experts at hand money, and then expectations around inclusion bases. There are huge expectations around inclusion bases. We work with hundreds. There are hundreds of inclusion bases in this country, or internal alternative provisions. We work with a charity called The Difference, supporting their work on that use online learning or other accessibility tools to power the curriculum in those bases. And it's really, really effective because those young learners are keeping up with the learning of those peers in their classroom, and they're able to have that cognitive break, that environmental break that allows them to stay connected to school. Just a few things really about why online matters. And I know you come to a session, you know, Amy and my role, and we run the largest online AP in the country. And there are some real specific factors that make it work. And these are important. These are the things that we often say at events like this. The first thing is about accessibility. It was that main thing I mentioned at the beginning. Every child deserves a right to education. But we'd be fooling ourselves, and I know you won't believe this, if we think every child can spend all day in a mainstream school. It just isn't the case. Now, the white paper, on a superficial level, thinks that, or purports to that. And there's nothing wrong with that ambition, but you have to have a safety net behind where you think it isn't going to work for all. And there are underneath that specialist provision, targeted plus provision, but a lot of it is focused on mainstream. What online does improves that access. It allows that child, if they're not in school, to not lose ground, to build confidence and stay connected, so they're not left without an education, and they reintegrate more simply as well as a result. High quality. One thing that we talk a lot about, and this is to the credit of the Department for Education, is we're a registered provision now. There's a scheme for online providers. That means that we are inspected by Ofsted. We have an Ofsted report. And so there is a growing shift in a regulatory sense towards making hybrid learning, online learning, a larger part of our future. There are already 1,200 schools that use it every year, so it's not a new thing. And so we're not surprised to see that on the Department for Education. But it is something, if you're not considering it already, that's well understood and something that's well backed. Inclusion-based capacity now. It's not a gloriously titled section, that. But actually, one of the main challenges we see in schools and why they come to us, and this is, I love these conversations, because the questions are always, I have more learners coming into my inclusion base. I have X many members of staff in it, and I need to teach them all. They're at different points, different phases, different points within that phase. How am I going to do it? And one of the great things about online is that can be a specific provision for that child in a generic space. And that space can have access to pastoral leads, therapeutic interventions. We have online counsellors, but we work with physical counsellors, for example. And those children are getting that welfare input whilst getting a very specific curriculum and their on-school site. And it's a real kind of perfect relationship, that, because that child isn't feeling ostracised. Some of them will be at home, medical needs. They could be having real medical challenges and they need a bit of time at home and they need to come back in. But when they're in that base, it's a much softer landing. And you can dial up and dial down the amount of online provision as they move back into their mainstream classroom. It's a really powerful model of reintegration, and one I highly suspect will grow. And finally, that flexibility around need. Today, my teachers in our school, Amy and my teachers, have taught the same lesson 7 times. The same English lesson. Maybe not the same teacher, but that teacher might have taught it 3 times. Because we put the same lesson on, because we're able to do that online. So it doesn't matter where a child is. They could be a Dungeness, or they could be a Doncaster, they could be Truro. I'm trying to think of a T in the north, something will come to me. But they are all doing the lesson at their time. And that's an amazing level of flexibility, because we know some learners don't operate as well in the morning. Some are better in the afternoon. Some have appointments, commitments, whatever it might be. And this gives you that flexibility. And these are just some examples. That's my old school. I was a deputy head at the top there. Inclusion-based area within the library. We'll call it inclusion-based, didn't call it that at the time, where children were able to access different types of provision. That's also another old school that we made into an area. And these are just examples: caretaker's office, classrooms. It doesn't really matter what it looks like, but there is an acceptance that these spaces are really important. And we know for the white paper, it's going to be one of the major things providing mainstream support for learners is hinged on a really effective base. So now is the time to think about, how do I actually do that? If you've got more learners, and you'll have more learners with more profound needs in your settings, in all likelihood, how in your primary school or in your secondary school are you going to cater for all of them with a very specific amount of money and a very specific amount of staff? And that's why we see colleagues in the sector coming to us and thinking, I actually need something quite specific, but I need to do something specific for 10 kids in the same space at the same time. And that's where innovation comes in. That's where technology use comes in, because it can be done. And here's just a couple of examples. Sitting Board School using us on site, nice testimonial there. And the reason I share that is because the things that you might suspect about online are it doesn't provide peer contact, socialization. It does. And it does, not just because they're in these social spaces when these learners are otherwise not. And one of the things we often compare, whether it's online or another form of AP to, is the child of which education is perfect for. But those aren't the children that need AP. They're not the ones that are coming to us. These are children who might be ostracized, they might be separated, they might be low ebb. And it gives them back because it brings them back into that community by feeling confident and feeling like they can return to the classroom. And this one here, this is probably my favourite one. Just hybrid provisioning. How do you provide, this is more the secondary thing arguably, but how do you provide support for learners at scale when they're trying to move towards examinations? When you might have enough teachers, or those children at the end of the day, they've got commitments, you're out in the rule setting, you've got to get the bus home. There's so many myriad different challenges. By using online for that purpose, we found that it's been highly, highly effective to allow learners to really connect and get better outcomes. Just a bit of research to underpin what Amy was saying earlier. I just want to lastly touch on, we're not doing too bad time actually, lastly touch on that idea of codifying. I got quite obsessive about this around, during COVID, I ran our schools when the children are coming in of key workers and working out, how do you get the right behaviours, the right movement, everything from your staff, from your students. And there's some really, really great research papers out there I'd strongly encourage you to have a look at. But this framework here, the EAST framework, and there's another one called Mindspace from the Behavioural Insights team, talk about how you create those defaults. So Amy talks about difference being default. But in your setting, in your primary school, whatever, how do you set it up, the environment, so that the behaviour that you want is exactly what you get? When we think about things like organ donation, there are much higher rates of organ donation in opt-out as opposed to opt-in countries. There are your bank account. Think about your bank account. How many of you changed your bank account since you were 20? I haven't. And most don't, because that's your default. How many use Google as your main browser? There are really great examples of defaults around you. And what we see in some of the most effective schools are that real deliberate thought about, okay, what's going to make a child stay in this inclusion base and want to be here or come here at the time that we've set? What's going to make those teachers visit that space and make sure they interact with the child and they give them feedback and they make them feel like they're going to be welcome back in the classroom? It's putting it on their timetable. It's putting it on the duty rotor. It's having standing items on your SLT agendas. It's the lighting. It's what's around the board. It's all of these different things that you think deliberately. What's it feel like? I'm a learner. I'm going into this space. What does it feel like? And that's been one of those profound things that I've seen in the best settings. They've really deeply thought about that. Even how tidy it is. It doesn't really matter. But all the things before the teacher says a word to the child are absolutely crucial. And that's how you create this default space that makes those what. And that is a fantastic report to show you all of the things that influence behaviour. And then you can use it as a framework for adapting your policies and your setting and your strategies. And the others will be well known around the importance of implementation as well. And my final two slides. Just back to the digital point, and I know some of you will be thinking that's kind of the reason I came to this session, or to learn a little bit more about this innovation. You've seen now just how many people are using online in its various forms. It's got LA backing, it's got Department for Education accreditation. This is kind of the last key messages. Digital is in everyone's future. It's different for young learners, and we only teach now to year 5. They're not younger at the moment. It's a conscious choice. It's different for older learners, but it's in everyone's future. That's different from, say, wanting children not to be on social media until they're 16. I'm an advocate for that. And it's different from wanting not too much screen time for young learners. I'm an advocate for that as well. We had breaks all through our day. We had lots of different things like that. But it is in everyone's future. And there's a reason for that. It's cost effective, and it can really reach learners who otherwise can't be reached. One environment won't work for all. You will all know that. But it's really important when you think about innovation to accept that as a premise and then think about how you adapt from there. And the last point I would say, we all know about early intervention, how much that matters. And that's another benefit one why. But our children, tomorrow, I'll have children I didn't know were going to join me this morning. And that's just the unique benefit of online. But absolute opinions will always exist, but reality is more complex. And when you are challenged, when you're trying to innovate, and whatever it might be, it may not be using a provision that those it might be something different. You are the kings and queens of your context. You know what matters, and people have like base fundamental opinions on it. But it's so much more messy than that. And if you keep that in mind, you keep anchored to that context, I often see that the solutions are better, and they're ratified and they're defendable, and that's really important as well.
And just lastly, about our students and partners and what they say. I share this slide quite a lot, but to be honest, and then we update it quite a lot as well. And the numbers always surprise me, but the main one is just how kids feel. And this is probably the same for lots of different alternatives, lots of different APs. All the children who, and they don't all reply to these surveys who reply, their school's made a conscious choice, they've made a brave choice with that child's curriculum, they've innovated with the provision that child's going to get, and that child is happier, and they feel more confident. And most of our children don't stay with us for very long, 40 days, and they go back. And that's a really key, that reintegration. But there's so much to be said for making that brave choice, because those kind of outcomes you get. And I think we're going to hear from a student and then pass over to her. But thank you for listening.
Sandra. So at the beginning, I asked you to ponder the question, when your learners leave for the last time, what do you hope that you in your setting have given them? And now I'd like to share with you mine. Ellis, one of our very first primary students to walk through our virtual doors. Ellis had been a non-school attender for a period of time, had had repeat suspensions and exclusions, and was awaiting a specialist placement. Parents were naturally quite apprehensive about this innovative idea that his setting had to have online learning in place for Ellis. You can read the quotes there. I sat in a meeting with Ellis's mom on camera, and she was very emotional. The words that stayed with me, I've got my son back. The power of a different approach can be transformational in how that young person, whether they are year 5 or whether they are year 13, how they feel about themselves as a person and about themselves as a learner. Once the first bit of that clicks into place, the academic progress, the trajectory is shifted enormously. And you'll see just on the top right there, this is the deputy head and Senko based at Ellis's school. I was just blown away by how much he was interacting. It brought me to tears to see the change in him, the way he was interacting, articulating himself and communicating with the members of staff. Now that brings me enormous pride. Me and my primary team, we wrote our curriculum from scratch, and it has been designed deliberately to interweave all of those end of key stage outcomes from the national curriculum in reading, writing and maths with opportunities for oracy, with explicit teaching of communication skills and speaking and listening, and with well-being and PSHE at the centre. So, my final point before we finish today's workshop, I'd like you to meet Jaya. Jaya is a past student. Jaya left in July. Jaya is now attending an on-site college studying 4 A-levels. Jaya had actually missed almost 3 years of school. She had emotionally based school non-attendance. She had that label prior to COVID. It was exacerbated during COVID, and she never made it back through the physical doors of her secondary school. In her words, she missed out on nearly 3 years of education. She was enrolled with us towards the end of year 10, so she was with us just shy of an academic year before she sat her GCSEs. Jaya left our virtual doors with straight 7, 8 and 9s. I'm really proud of that academic achievement, and I'm really proud of her ambition to go on to study law. But more than anything, I take enormous pride in what we were able to instill in her that opened the doors to reintegrating into the world, because my goodness, this girl has got so much to offer. So the finishing note is in Jaya's words.
I'd always been engaged with my learning and always really enjoyed the academic side to school. However, I often struggled with the social aspect of it and found it challenging to maintain regular attendance at school And this only got worse after lockdown. And this led me to missing a significant amount of my learning. I believe it was around 2.5 years, so almost 3 years of missed education. And I think it was around this time of my life where an alternate online provision was introduced to me through my school. And gradually the conversation shifted to which methods of support I needed and what would be right for me. And I felt as though Academy21 was well tailored to my needs and provided a flexible learning space that felt both manageable and achievable. So overall, I'd say my experience with Academy21 was hugely positive because it allowed me to stay connected to my studies in a similar way to my peers and gave me the opportunity to actively work towards my GCSEs at a pace that felt comfortable and at a pace that benefited me.
Jay is now studying sociology, law and politics in a physical college, and we mentored her recently in a CV writing workshop, and she is so excited about embracing the rest of her education and also life after that, giving back to a community that she feels is underrepresented. To finish, before we have a few short minutes for Q&As, I love this quote. It's probably one you're familiar with. Diversity is being invited to the party. It's easy to do the invitation. Inclusion is being asked to dance. So the question I'm going to leave you with is, how are you inviting every single one of your students to dance? Thank you, colleagues.